Welcome to today's exploration of one of history's most fascinating topics, the lives of women in ancient Rome and the institution of marriage that shaped their existence. When we think of ancient Rome, our minds often conjure images of gladiators, emperors, and conquering legions, but behind these masculine facades existed a complex world of women who navigated intricate social structures, wielded surprising degrees of influence, and lived lives far more nuanced than popular culture often portrays. Over the next 2 hours, we'll journey through the streets of ancient Rome, from the Republic through the height of the Empire, to understand how Roman women experienced love, marriage, family, and society itself. The story of Roman women is not a simple tale of oppression or liberation. It's a story of contradictions, of legal restrictions paired with practical freedoms, of idealized modesty alongside scandalous behavior, of powerlessness in law yet influence in reality. To understand Roman marriage is to understand the very foundation of Roman society, because for the Romans, marriage wasn't primarily about love or personal fulfillment. It was about family alliances, property transfer, producing legitimate heirs, and maintaining the social order that kept Rome functioning. Yet within these rigid structures, real people found genuine affection, exercised agency, and created lives of meaning. Before we dive into the specifics of marriage ceremonies and daily life, we need to understand that there was no single experience of being a Roman woman. A wealthy patrician woman in the late Republic lived a dramatically different life than a freedwoman running a tavern in the 2nd century CE, who, in turn, had little in common with an enslaved woman working in a household, or a peasant farmer's wife in the provinces. Class, wealth, time period, and legal status created vast differences in women's experiences. However, certain threads run through all these experiences, certain expectations and assumptions that all Roman women navigated, and it's these common elements that we'll explore today. To understand Roman marriage, we must first grasp a fundamental concept that defined all Roman women's lives. They were perpetually under the legal authority of a man, a condition called being in manu, or under someone's hand. From birth, a Roman girl was under the authority of her paterfamilias, the oldest living male in her direct paternal line, typically her father, but sometimes her grandfather or even great-grandfather. This wasn't just a formality. The paterfamilias had extraordinary legal power, including in archaic times the theoretical right of life and death over his children, though by the late Republic and Empire, this power had become largely symbolic, and its actual exercise would have been scandalous. When a Roman woman married, depending on the type of marriage, she might pass from her father's authority to her husband's authority, or she might remain under her father's power while living with her husband. This created a fascinating dynamic that we'll explore in depth shortly. What's crucial to understand is that Roman women, regardless of age or wisdom, were considered legally incapable of managing their own affairs in the same way men could. They required a male guardian, called a tutor, to authorize major financial transactions, though by the imperial period, clever women and sympathetic guardians had found numerous ways around these restrictions. However, and this is where Roman society becomes interesting, legal disability did not mean practical powerlessness. Roman women, especially those of the upper classes, could own property, inherit wealth, and manage large estates. They ran businesses, sponsored public works, and influenced politics, even though they could never vote or hold office. The letters of Cicero, one of our richest sources for Republican-era Rome, are filled with references to powerful women like Clodia, who clearly exercised significant social and political influence despite having no formal political rights. The disconnect between legal theory and social reality is one of the most fascinating aspects of Roman women's lives. Roman society was deeply patriarchal, organized around the concept of patria potestas, the power of the father. The familia, or household, was the basic unit of society, and it included not just blood relatives but also slaves, freedmen, and other dependents. The Roman man, as paterfamilias, was expected to manage this household with wisdom and authority, maintaining discipline and ensuring the family's honor and prosperity. Women's primary role in this system was as managers of the domestic sphere and as vessels for producing legitimate heirs who would continue the family line. The ideal Roman woman was modest, chaste, devoted to her household, skilled in woolworking and loyal to her husband. This ideal was embodied in legendary figures like Lucretia, whose rape by the king's son and subsequent suicide supposedly sparked the revolution that created the Roman Republic. Lucretia's story, whether historical or mythical, was told and retold to Roman girls as an example of how a woman should value her honor above even her life. Similarly, Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi brothers, was celebrated for her learning, her wise counsel to her sons, and her reported response when asked about her jewels. She pointed to her children and said, "These are my jewels." These idealized women set impossible standards, but they also reveal what Roman society claimed to value in its women: pudicitia, or chastity, pietas, or devotion to family and gods, and dignitas, or dignity befitting one's station. Yet the reality was far more complex than these ideals suggest. Roman literature and historical sources are filled with women who defied expectations, who were accused of adultery, who divorced repeatedly, who poisoned their husbands, who controlled vast fortunes, who wrote poetry, and who involved themselves in politics. The very fact that Roman moralists constantly complained about women's behavior tells us that many women didn't conform to the ideal. Cato the Elder, the stern moralist of the 2nd century BCE, famously grumbled about women's growing independence and luxury. The poet Juvenal, writing in the early 2nd century CE, penned vicious satires about women who dared to be educated, athletic, or independent. The very existence of these complaints proves that Roman women were not simply passive vessels of male authority. The legal status of Roman women evolved significantly over the nearly 1,000-year span of Roman civilization. In the early Republic, a woman's subordination was more complete, her dependence on male relatives more absolute. By the late Republic and early Empire, women had gained greater practical, if not legal, independence. The Augustan marriage laws of the early Empire attempted to reimpose stricter controls on women's behavior, but they also inadvertently granted new freedoms. For instance, under the ius trium liberorum, the right of 3 children, a freeborn woman who had borne 3 children or a freed woman who had borne 4, could be exempted from guardianship and manage her own property. This was a significant privilege, and Augustus granted it to women he wished to honor. Marriage was central to a Roman woman's identity because it was through marriage that she fulfilled her primary social function, producing legitimate Roman citizens. Roman society was obsessed with legitimacy and bloodlines. Inheritance, political rights, and social status all depended on being born to legally married parents of appropriate status. A child born outside of lawful marriage was illegitimate and could not inherit from their father or carry his name. This made marriage not just a personal choice, but a civic necessity, and it made women's sexual behavior a matter of public concern in ways that men's rarely was. Roman marriage was not a single institution, but rather came in several distinct forms, each with different legal implications for the woman involved. The oldest and most traditional form was called conferatio, a highly religious ceremony involving the sacrifice of a spelt cake, from which the ceremony took its name. This type of marriage was required for certain priesthoods and was associated with the patrician class, Rome's old aristocracy. In a conferatio marriage, the woman passed completely from her father's authority into her husband's authority. She became part of her husband's family legally and religiously, and her property, if she had any, became his to control. Another ancient form of marriage was called coemptio, which literally means buying together. Despite the name, this wasn't actually a purchase of the bride, though it had archaic origins in such a transaction. Instead, it was a symbolic ceremony using scales and bronze, similar to other formal Roman transactions. Like conferatio, coemptio placed the wife under her husband's manus, or hand, meaning his legal authority. However, by the late Republic, these forms of marriage with manus had become increasingly rare, replaced by a very different arrangement. The most common form of marriage in the late Republic and Empire was called free marriage or marriage sine manu, meaning without the hand, without the husband's legal authority. In this type of marriage, a woman remained under her father's authority even after marriage. This might sound worse for the woman, but in practice it often gave her significantly more independence. A woman in a sine manu marriage retained ownership of her own property, which her husband could not touch. she could potentially divorce more easily. And as her father aged and eventually died, she would come under the guardianship of a tutor, who, especially if he was chosen by her father with her interests in mind, might be quite amenable to her wishes. The betrothal, or sponsalia, typically occurred years before the actual marriage, sometimes when the girl was merely a child. Roman girls could be legally betrothed from the age of 7, though the minimum age for marriage itself was 12 for girls and 14 for boys. These ages shock our modern sensibilities, but they were based on the Roman understanding of puberty as the marker of adulthood. In practice, many families, especially those of higher status, did marry their daughters very young, at 12 or 13, to much older men. This age gap was considered normal and even desirable, as the husband was supposed to be established enough to support a family. The betrothal was a serious contract, though it could be broken more easily than marriage itself. It was typically arranged between the fathers of the bride and groom, with the young couple having little or no say in the matter. The betrothal served several purposes. It created an alliance between families, it began the process of negotiating the dowry, and it signaled the family's intentions to the broader community. A betrothal ceremony might include the exchange of gifts, particularly a ring, which the bride-to-be would wear on the third finger of her left hand, a tradition the Romans believed connected directly to the heart by a special vein. The dowry, or does, was a crucial component of Roman marriage, and deserves our careful attention. Unlike in some cultures where the bride price was paid by the groom's family to the bride's family, the Roman dowry was property that came with the bride from her family to the marriage. This typically included money, land, slaves, or other valuable goods. The purpose of the dowry was ostensibly to help support the wife during the marriage and to provide for her if she was widowed or divorced. During the marriage, the husband controlled the dowry and could use its income, but he could not dispose of the capital without the wife's consent, and he was obligated to return it if the marriage ended. The dowry created a fascinating economic dynamic. For the bride's father, it was a significant expense, though a necessary one to secure his daughter's future and forge a valuable alliance. The larger the dowry, the more prestigious a husband the family could attract. For the groom, the dowry was a substantial financial benefit, providing capital that could be invested or used. However, it also represented a liability, because if the marriage ended, he would have to return it. This created a powerful incentive for husbands to maintain their marriages, and it gave wives a certain degree of economic leverage. The negotiation of the dowry could be complex and contentious. Families haggled over the amount, the form it would take, and the conditions under which it might be returned. Wealthy families sometimes included in the dowry arrangement stipulations about how the wife should be treated or maintained. The Roman legal system developed elaborate rules about dowries, covering what happened to dowry property if it increased in value, who was responsible for expenses, what happened if property was damaged, and countless other contingencies. These rules fill substantial portions of the Roman legal codes and demonstrate how central the dowry was to the institution of marriage. Not all marriages involved dowries, particularly among the lower classes who might have little property to transfer. However, even modest families tried to provide something, as a marriage without a dowry could be seen as less respectable or could leave the wife vulnerable. Some women, particularly widows remarrying, would provide their own dowries from property they had inherited. The cultural expectation was strong enough that even when not legally required, families felt obligated to provide some form of dowry. The arrangement of marriages, especially in the upper classes, was fundamentally about family strategy, rather than individual happiness. Families used marriage to create political alliances, settle feuds, combine estates, or gain social advancement. A wealthy plebeian family might marry their daughter to an impoverished patrician to gain social prestige. A family seeking political power might marry into a family with strong connections in the Senate. These strategic considerations often outweighed any concern for the personal compatibility of the couple. Yet we should not assume that affection was entirely absent from these arranged marriages. Many couples seem to have developed genuine love and partnership. Funeral inscriptions in particular often express deep affection between spouses, and while parents arranged marriages, they sometimes did consider their children's preferences, or at least their willingness. There are documented cases of women refusing proposed marriages, though their ability to do so depended heavily on their relationship with their father and their family circumstances. The Roman wedding was an elaborate affair filled with ritual and symbolism, a public performance that marked the transition from daughter to wife and created a new alliance between families. Unlike modern Western weddings, which are often religious ceremonies, Roman weddings were primarily civil and social events, though they incorporated religious elements and sought the favor of the gods. The ceremony typically took place over several days and included numerous traditional elements, each with its own meaning and significance. The process began with the taking of auspices, the reading of omens to ensure that the gods favored the union. This was a serious matter, as Romans believed that beginning a marriage under bad omens would doom it to failure. The auspices were usually taken by examining the entrails of sacrificed animals, or observing the flight of birds. Only after favorable omens were confirmed would the family proceed with the wedding itself. This practice reveals how Romans understood marriage as something that required divine approval and participation, not merely human agreement. On the wedding day itself, the bride underwent an elaborate preparation process. She dressed in a special wedding outfit that had been prescribed by tradition for centuries. She wore a white tunic called a tunica recta, woven in an ancient style on an old-fashioned upright loom. Over this, she wore a saffron-colored cloak or palla, and on her feet were saffron-colored shoes. But perhaps the most distinctive element of her outfit was her hairstyle. Her hair was arranged in an ancient style called the sex crines, 6 locks separated by narrow ribbons, and over this she wore a bright orange veil called the flammeum. This veil covered her head and face, and its unusual color is thought to have symbolized fire and fertility. The bride also wore a wreath or crown, often made from flowers and herbs that she had gathered herself, following ancient custom. Around her waist, she wore a special belt called the cingulum, tied in a complex knot called the Hercules knot, or nodus herculaneus. This knot was significant because only her husband was allowed to untie it on their wedding night, a symbolic act representing the consummation of the marriage and the transition from virgin to wife. The entire outfit, with its archaic elements and prescribed colors, linked the bride to countless generations of Roman women before her, and emphasized the timeless nature of the ritual she was performing. The wedding ceremony itself typically took place at the bride's family home, in the atrium or main hall. Guests would gather, often a large crowd including family members, friends, clients, and associates of both families. The ceremony centered on the joining of hands, the dextrum iunctio, which was the moment when the marriage was actually contracted. The bride and groom would clasp right hands, while a matron, who had been married only once, called a pranuba, stood as witness and helped join their hands together. This moment was so iconic that it appears on countless marriage sarcophagi and other artworks. The words spoken during the ceremony were relatively simple. The bride would say, "Ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia," which means, "Where you are Gaius, I am Gaia," using the generic male and female names. This formula expressed the wife's commitment to follow her husband and to share his fate. While modern ears might hear subjugation in these words, Romans heard partnership and unity. The formula indicated that the bride was entering fully into her husband's family and circumstances, taking his position as her own. Following the hand joining, the couple would participate in a symbolic sharing of bread and fire. Fire was represented by the sacred hearth, and the bread was often a special cake made from far, a type of wheat. This sharing represented the couple's commitment to share their household, their resources, and their lives. Witnesses would then sign the marriage contract, if there was one, making the union legally binding. Not all marriages had written contracts, but among the propertied classes, they were common and would detail the dowry arrangements and other terms. After the ceremony in the bride's home, the next major ritual was the deductio, the procession that brought the bride to her husband's house. This was an elaborate public spectacle that could be quite raucous. The bride would affect to resist leaving her mother's arms, a symbolic representation of her reluctance to leave her childhood home. This pretended resistance was part of the ritual, expected and traditional. Once torn from her mother, the bride would be led in procession through the streets to her new home. The wedding procession was a joyful, noisy affair. Torchbearers led the way even if the wedding was during daylight hours, as the torches had symbolic significance related to purification and warding off evil. Musicians played flutes and other instruments. Singers sang traditional wedding songs, some of which were quite bawdy and crude, full of sexual jokes and references. The Romans believed that this ribald humor actually protected the couple by deflecting the evil eye and jealous spirits. Guests threw nuts at the couple, symbolizing fertility and the groom's leaving behind of his own childhood, as nuts were associated with children's games. The bride was accompanied by 3 boys whose parents were still living. 2 walked beside her, holding her hands, while a 3rd walked ahead carrying a torch made of hawthorn, which was lit from the hearth of the bride's family home and would be used to light the hearth in her new home, symbolically connecting the 2 households. The bride herself carried a spindle and distaff, symbols of her future role as a wool-working housewife. She also carried 3 copper coins. 1 she would give to her husband, 1 she would place on the household shrine to the lares, or household gods in her new home, and 1 she would offer at the nearest crossroads shrine to the gods of the neighborhood. When the procession reached the groom's house, another significant ritual occurred. The bride would smear the doorposts with oil and fat and hang wool fillets on them. This act symbolized her dedication to keeping the household well supplied and was thought to bring prosperity. Then came one of the most famous Roman wedding customs. The groom would lift the bride and carry her across the threshold. She was not allowed to stumble or to let her feet touch the threshold itself, as this was considered a terrible omen. The reason for this custom is debated, but it may have been to avoid ill omens associated with stumbling, or it may have been a symbolic reenactment of the rape of the Sabine women, the mythical abduction that helped populate early Rome. Once inside, the bride would be greeted by her husband with fire and water, the essential elements of the household. She would say, "Ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia," once more, and she would touch the hearth and the water, symbolically taking her place as mistress of the household. She would then make offerings to her new household gods, integrating herself into the family's sacred traditions. The wedding feast would follow, often an elaborate dinner with many guests. This feast could last well into the night, and was a major expense for the families involved. Finally, at the end of the evening, the bride would be escorted to the marriage bed by married women, particularly by the pronuba who had assisted at the ceremony. The bed itself would have been ritually prepared and placed in the atrium of the house. This public nature of even the bedding might seem strange to us, but it emphasized that marriage was not a purely private affair, but a matter of public interest and family continuity. The actual consummation was private, but the leading to the chamber was witnessed, ensuring that the community knew the marriage had been fully contracted. The day after the wedding, the new wife would perform a sacrifice to the gods of her new household, marking her full integration into the family. She might also receive visits from friends and family offering congratulations and gifts. This post-wedding ritual marked the completion of the marriage process and the beginning of her life as a married woman, no longer a daughter in her father's house, but a wife in her husband's household. The daily life of a married Roman woman varied enormously depending on her social class, the time period where she lived, and her individual circumstances. However, we can sketch a general picture of what life was like for women of different classes, beginning with the elite women who left us the most historical evidence, and then considering the lives of women lower on the social ladder. For a wealthy woman of the senatorial or equestrian classes during the late Republic or early Empire, the day might begin early, perhaps at dawn. Unlike Greek women who were often secluded in separate women's quarters, Roman women of the upper classes had considerably more freedom of movement. Our wealthy matron might wake in her own bedroom, though she likely shared it with her husband. She would be attended by enslaved women who would help her dress and arrange her hair. Roman hairstyles, especially for wealthy women, could be elaborate and time-consuming, with curls built up high on the head, braids, and hairpieces. Her clothing would typically consist of several layers. She would wear a tunica or tunic as her basic garment, over which she might wear a stola, a long dress-like garment that marked her as a respectable married woman. The stola was the female equivalent of the toga, a symbol of status and respectability. Over this, when going out, she would wear a palla, a shawl or cloak. Jewelry was important to wealthy women, both as adornment and as a display of the family's wealth and status. She might wear rings, earrings, necklaces, and bracelets, some quite elaborate and valuable. After dressing, our matron would likely attend to her religious duties. Roman religion was heavily domestic, centered on the household gods, and women played a crucial role in maintaining the family's relationship with these deities. She might make offerings at the household shrine to the lares, the protective spirits of the household, or to the penates, the gods of the storeroom. On certain days, she might have more elaborate religious obligations, as Roman religious calendar was filled with festivals and observances, many of which required women's participation. A significant portion of a wealthy woman's day would be spent managing her household. Despite having numerous enslaved workers to do the actual labor, the materfamilias, or mother of the household, was expected to oversee everything. She would supervise the enslaved workers who cleaned the house, prepared food, cared for children, and performed the countless other tasks necessary to run a large household. She would manage the household accounts, deciding what to buy, what to prepare, and how to allocate resources. This was not a trivial responsibility in a large urban household that might include dozens or even hundreds of enslaved people, along with free servants and dependents. Woolworking was traditionally the defining activity of the virtuous Roman wife, so much so that funeral inscriptions praised women by noting they were lanifica, wool workers. Even wealthy women who could afford to have all their clothing made by skilled enslaved workers were expected to at least symbolically engage in spinning and weaving. Some women genuinely enjoyed these crafts and became quite skilled. The image of the Roman wife sitting in her atrium spinning wool while her husband received clients in the morning was iconic and represented the ideal of domestic harmony and proper gender roles. However, many wealthy women, especially by the late Republic and Empire, were not content to limit themselves to domestic activities. They engaged in business, owning and managing property, shops, and even shipping concerns. Legal restrictions meant they technically needed a male guardian's approval for major transactions. But in practice, many women found compliant guardians or worked around these restrictions. Women could not appear in court themselves, but they could own property and hire others to manage their legal affairs. Some women became quite wealthy in their own right, through inheritance, business acumen, or both. Socializing was an important part of life for upper-class Roman women. Unlike their Greek counterparts, Roman women could attend dinner parties with their husbands, though they sat while men reclined. They could receive visitors, including male friends of the family. They could attend public spectacles, the theater, gladiatorial games, and chariot races, though at some periods and venues they were restricted to certain seats. They could visit friends, go shopping in the markets, and visit the baths, though usually at different times than men, or in separate facilities. Some women pursued education and cultural interests. While formal education for girls was less common and less advanced than for boys, some families did educate their daughters, especially in the late Republic and Empire. Women could learn to read and write, study literature and poetry, and engage in philosophical discussions. A few women even became writers, though most of their works haven't survived. Sulpicia, a poet from the Augustan age, left us some love elegies, and we know of other female writers from references in male authors' works. These educated women could participate in the literary salons and intellectual discussions that were an important part of upper-class Roman culture. Motherhood was, of course, a central part of most married women's lives. Roman women typically bore their first child young, within a year or two of marriage, and continued having children through their 20s and into their 30s. Childbirth was dangerous, and maternal mortality was high. Women who survived the ordeal were expected to breastfeed their own infants, though in practice, wealthy women often employed wet nurses, enslaved women who would breastfeed the elite children. This practice was controversial, with moralists like Tacitus criticizing it as decadent and un-Roman, but it remained common. The early years of child-rearing were entirely the mother's domain. She would oversee the care of infants and young children, though again, the actual caregiving in wealthy families was often done by enslaved nurses and attendants. As children grew, mothers continued to play an important role in their education and development. Some mothers taught their children themselves, while others hired tutors or sent children to schools. The relationship between Roman mothers and their children could be quite close, and we have touching evidence of maternal love in letters and epitaphs. For women of the lower classes, life was quite different in many ways, though some patterns remained consistent. A shopkeeper's wife or a freedwoman running a tavern would have had to work for her living in a much more direct way than an aristocratic matron. She might help in the family business, serving customers, keeping accounts, or managing inventory. If her husband died, she might well take over the business entirely. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii and other sites shows us that women ran bakeries, fulleries, inns, and other commercial enterprises. The homes of ordinary Romans were far smaller and simpler than aristocratic mansions. Most urban Romans lived in apartment buildings called insulae, often in cramped conditions with multiple families sharing small spaces. A working-class wife would have to do much of her own housework, cooking, cleaning, and childcare, perhaps with help from daughters or a single enslaved worker if the family could afford one. Her day would be filled with practical tasks, fetching water from public fountains, shopping at markets, preparing food, making and mending clothing, and all the other labor required to keep a household functioning. Rural women, who made up the majority of the population, lived yet another kind of life. The wife of a small farmer would work alongside her husband in the fields during busy seasons, in addition to her domestic responsibilities. She might tend a kitchen garden, care for chickens or other small animals, preserve food for winter, and perform countless other agricultural tasks. Life was hard and precarious, dependent on the harvest and the weather, and women's labor was essential to the family's survival. Regardless of class, married women were expected to maintain their sexual virtue. Roman society had a sharp double standard when it came to sexual behavior. Men could have sexual relations with enslaved people, prostitutes, and even young enslaved boys with little social consequence, though excessive debauchery might be criticized. But married women were expected to be strictly faithful to their husbands. Adultery by a wife was a serious crime, and a husband could legally divorce an adulterous wife and was socially expected to do so. Under Augustus's moral legislation, adultery became a criminal offense that could be prosecuted in the courts, with severe penalties including exile and loss of property. The emphasis on female chastity was not primarily about love or fidelity in the romantic sense, but about ensuring the legitimacy of children and protecting family property and bloodlines. A man needed to be certain that his legal heir was actually his biological child. This obsession with legitimacy explains why Romans were so concerned with women's sexual behavior while being relatively unconcerned with men's extramarital affairs. This double standard was deeply embedded in Roman law and culture, and it shaped how women experienced marriage and sexuality. Despite their legal disabilities and the patriarchal structure of Roman society, Roman women, particularly those of the upper classes, exercised considerable influence and power through indirect channels. Understanding how this worked requires us to look beyond formal legal rights to the social and familial networks through which power actually flowed in Roman society. The private sphere, which was women's domain, was not truly separate from the public sphere of politics and business. They were deeply intertwined, and women who understood this could leverage their positions to significant effect. Within the household, the materfamilias had considerable authority. She managed a complex enterprise that included enslaved workers, free dependents, financial resources, and social relationships. A capable woman could effectively run a large household, making decisions that affected dozens or hundreds of people. Her husband might nominally be the head of the household, but if he was often away on business or military campaigns, or if he trusted his wife's judgment, she could have de facto control over substantial resources and many people's lives. Roman women could own property in their own right, and many did, especially as daughters and widows. The Roman inheritance system, unlike some ancient cultures, allowed daughters to inherit from their fathers, though sons typically received larger shares. A woman might inherit land, buildings, businesses, cash, and enslaved people. During marriage, her husband would manage her property if she was in a marriage with Manus, but in the increasingly common sine manu marriages, her property remained legally separate from her husband's, managed by her guardian, but often effectively under her control. Widows could be particularly wealthy and independent, as they might inherit substantial property from their husbands, in addition to what they owned from their own families. This economic power translated into social and even political influence, Wealthy women were patrons to many clients, both male and female, who depended on them for support and opportunity. They funded public buildings, sponsored festivals, and made loans. Inscriptions from across the Roman world testify to women's public benefactions. In some provincial cities, women held honorary positions and priesthoods that gave them status and influence. While they couldn't hold political office or vote, they could and did shape politics through their relationships with men who could. The most direct form of female political influence was through family relationships. Wives influenced their husbands, mothers their sons, sisters their brothers. In a society where family connections were the basis of political alliances, these relationships mattered enormously. A politically ambitious man needed his female relatives to support his alliances through their own marriages and social connections. Women arranged marriages, negotiated alliances, and lobbied on behalf of their male relatives. This was not secret or shameful, but recognized and expected, though there were limits beyond which a woman's political involvement might be criticized as improper. Some women became notorious for their political involvement. During the late Republic, women like Servilia, Brutus's mother and Caesar's lover, and Fulvia, Mark Antony's wife, were deeply involved in the political machinations of their time. Fulvia was particularly remarkable, effectively running Antony's affairs in Italy while he was in the East, raising armies, negotiating with political opponents, and even wearing a sword. Ancient authors depicted her as a terrifying virago who had stepped far outside proper female behavior, but their criticism itself testifies to her genuine power and effectiveness. The imperial period saw the rise of extremely powerful women in the imperial family itself. The emperor's wife, mother, and daughters could wield enormous influence. Livia, wife of Augustus, was perhaps the most powerful woman in Roman history. She advised her husband on policy, managed vast estates, received foreign embassies, and was honored with statues and titles. After Augustus's death, she remained a powerful figure during her son Tiberius's reign, though the relationship between mother and son was reportedly tense, partly because Tiberius resented her influence. Later imperial women were equally formidable. Agrippina the Younger, mother of Nero, essentially ruled the empire during the early years of her son's reign, attending Senate meetings behind a curtain and making decisions in his name. Plotina, wife of Trajan, influenced the succession, helping to ensure that Hadrian became emperor. Julia Domna, wife of Septimius Severus, was given the title Mother of the Camp and Mother of the Senate, and exercised substantial power. These women show that despite formal legal restrictions, determined and capable women in the right positions could exercise power that rivaled or exceeded that of most men. However, the power of imperial women was contested and controversial. Ancient authors frequently criticized powerful women, portraying them as manipulative, cruel, and unnatural. These criticisms reveal anxiety about women's power and the threat it posed to traditional gender hierarchies. Powerful women were accused of poisoning their rivals, manipulating weak men, and generally causing chaos. Some of these accusations were undoubtedly true, but many were probably exaggerated or invented to discredit women who exercised power in ways that made men uncomfortable. Beyond the imperial family, upper-class women exercised influence through salons and social networks. Educated women hosted gatherings where politics, literature, and philosophy were discussed. While they couldn't participate in formal political institutions, these informal networks shaped public opinion and created alliances. A woman who hosted successful salon could bring together men who might not otherwise meet, facilitate alliances. Her house became a center of cultural and political life, and her favor became something men courted. Women also exercised power through religion. Roman religion included numerous cults and priesthoods open to women. The Vestal Virgins were perhaps the most prestigious, a small group of women who tended the sacred fire of Vesta and enjoyed remarkable privileges. They were independent of male guardianship, could own property freely, had the best seats at public spectacles, and could pardon condemned criminals they met on the street. They were so respected that even consuls and praetors made way for them. Other female priesthoods, while less prestigious than the Vestals, also provided women with public roles, religious authority, and opportunities to exercise influence. In the provinces, Women sometimes held even more prominent religious positions. In the Greek East, women served as priestesses of various cults and could hold significant local influence. In some communities, women held positions as civic priestesses or benefactors that gave them status approaching that of male magistrates. The diversity of the Roman Empire meant that women's roles varied considerably depending on local traditions and practices, and in some places, women had opportunities that would have been unavailable in Rome itself. Less elite women exercised power and influence in different ways. The owner of a successful tavern or shop would have economic independence and social standing in her neighborhood. She might be a patron to poorer women, a source of employment, loans, and support. In urban neighborhoods and small towns, these networks of mutual obligation and support were crucial to daily life, and women were central to creating and maintaining them. While these women had nothing like the influence of an empress or aristocrat, within their communities they could be powerful and respected figures. Women also found ways to resist and subvert male authority in their personal lives. While the ideal was wifely obedience, the reality was often quite different. Women manipulated their guardians, found loopholes in laws, and used social pressure to get their way. They divorced husbands, conducted affairs, and pursued their own interests, even when this violated social norms. The fact that Roman moralists constantly complained about women's behavior suggests that many women did not conform to the submissive ideal, but instead found ways to assert their own agency and desires. The nature of the marital relationship itself varied enormously depending on the individuals involved, their age difference, their temperament, and their circumstances. Some Roman marriages were characterized by genuine affection and partnership, while others were cold, contractual arrangements, and still others were marked by conflict and abuse. Our sources give us glimpses of this diversity, though we must always remember that our evidence is biased toward the literate elite and toward situations dramatic or unusual enough to be worth recording. Epitaphs and funeral inscriptions provide some of our most touching evidence of marital affection. Husbands praised their deceased wives in terms that suggest genuine love and loss. One famous inscription describes a wife as rare because the marriage lasted 41 years without marital discord. The very fact that such a marriage was considered unusual tells us that conflict was common, but the tender language of the inscription also tells us that affection was valued and real. Wives commemorated husbands in similarly loving terms, emphasizing partnership, companionship, and shared life. Letters also give us intimate glimpses into marriages. Pliny the Younger's letters to his young wife Calpurnia are filled with affection and longing when they're apart. He praises her intelligence, her interest in his work, and her love for him. She reads his writings, sets them to music, and eagerly awaits his return when he's away. Whether Pliny's depiction was entirely accurate or partly idealized, it shows that at least some Romans valued emotional and intellectual compatibility in marriage, and that affection between spouses was seen as desirable and praiseworthy. The age gap common in Roman marriages, where a young bride of 12 or 13 might marry a man of 30 or more, would have shaped the marital relationship in significant ways. Such marriages were fundamentally unequal, with the husband having vastly more life experience, education, and power than his young wife. In the best cases, an older husband might be protective and educational, helping his wife develop and mature. In the worst cases, he might be exploitative or dismissive. The relationship would likely change over time as the wife matured and gained experience and confidence. Some marriages involved couples closer in age, particularly remarriages where both partners were widowed or divorced. These marriages might involve a more equal partnership between mature adults. Cicero's letters mention several such marriages among his friends and associates, and these seem to have often been based on mutual respect and shared interests as much as on family alliance and practical considerations. The question of love in Roman marriage is complex. Romans certainly understood romantic love and passionate desire, as their poetry and literature makes abundantly clear. However, they typically distinguished this kind of intense passion from the affection and partnership appropriate to marriage. Passionate love was seen as potentially dangerous and destabilizing, while marital affection or conjugal love was steadier and based on mutual respect, shared life, and partnership. The ideal was for spouses to develop deep affection for each other over time, bound together by shared experiences, children, and mutual interests. Sexual relations within marriage were expected and necessary for producing children, but Roman sources rarely discuss the sexual satisfaction of married women. Sex was often portrayed as something husbands took from wives, part of the wife's duty rather than a mutual pleasure. However, some medical writers did discuss female pleasure and even suggested it was necessary for conception, indicating that at least some Romans understood that women could and should enjoy sexual relations. The reality of marital sexual relations undoubtedly varied widely, from tender and mutual to perfunctory or even coerced. Domestic violence was a reality in many Roman marriages, as it has been throughout history. Husbands had enormous power over their wives, and while Roman law and custom did place some limits on that power, enforcement was difficult and depended largely on whether other male family members would intervene. A husband could beat his wife if he believed she had transgressed, and while excessive violence might be criticized, a certain amount was considered his right. Women had little formal recourse, though they might flee to family members, seek intervention from their fathers or brothers, or in extreme cases, pursue divorce. Divorce in Rome was remarkably easy by ancient standards, which is itself significant. Either spouse could initiate a divorce simply by declaring the intention to end the marriage. No grounds were legally required, no elaborate legal proceedings were necessary. This ease of divorce had important implications for the power dynamics within marriage. A wife unhappy in her marriage could theoretically leave, especially if she had family support and a dowry to be returned. This gave women a certain amount of leverage and meant that husbands who wanted to maintain their marriages had incentive to treat their wives reasonably. In practice, of course, divorce was more complicated than the legal simplicity suggests. Social pressure against divorce was strong, especially for women. A woman who divorced was suspect, particularly if she divorced multiple times. She might be accused of inconstancy, immorality, or being a bad wife. Her remarriage prospects might be diminished, and most importantly, she would typically lose daily contact with her children, who belonged to their father and would remain with him or his family after divorce. This made divorce emotionally devastating for many women, even if it was legally simple. Nevertheless, divorce was common in Rome, especially among the upper classes, where marriages were often tools of political alliance. When political circumstances changed, marriages that had served their purpose might be ended to make new, more advantageous alliances. The late Republic in particular saw frequent divorce and remarriage among the elite. Augustus himself divorced his first wife to marry Livia, who was pregnant by her previous husband when they married. Pompey, Caesar, Mark Antony, and many other leading men divorced and remarried multiple times for political reasons. The dowry system made divorce financially complicated. When a marriage ended, the dowry had to be returned to the wife or her family, which could be a significant financial burden for the husband, especially if he had invested the dowry and couldn't easily liquidate those investments. This created a built-in financial disincentive for husbands to divorce their wives. However, if the wife was deemed at fault for the divorce, through adultery or other serious misbehavior, the husband might be allowed to retain part of the dowry as compensation. Children complicated divorce in both practical and emotional ways. By law, children of a Roman marriage belonged to the father's familia, not the mother's. When a couple divorced, children remained with the father or his family. A mother might maintain some contact with her children after divorce, but she had no legal rights over them. This must have made divorce agonizing for mothers, forcing them to choose between escaping an unhappy or abusive marriage and maintaining daily contact with their children. Some women undoubtedly remained in bad marriages because they couldn't bear to leave their children. Remarriage after divorce was common and socially acceptable, though more so for men than for women. A divorced man could remarry immediately without social stigma. A divorced woman could also remarry, and many did, but she faced more scrutiny and criticism. If she remarried too quickly, she might be accused of having been unfaithful during her previous marriage or of not properly mourning its end. If she remarried multiple times, she risked being labeled promiscuous or unstable. The double standard that governed sexual behavior also governed remarriage, with women held to stricter standards than men. Widowhood was an even more common cause of remarriage than divorce, as life expectancy was short and many people outlived multiple spouses. A widow with young children might remarry to provide her children with a father and protector, and to gain economic security. A wealthy widow might remarry for companionship or to cement a political alliance. Or she might choose not to remarry at all, especially if she was older and had grown children, as widowhood could provide a kind of independence unavailable to married women or unmarried daughters. The Romans particularly honored the univira, a woman who had married only once and remained faithful to that one husband until death. Funeral inscriptions often mentioned if a woman had been married only once, suggesting this was seen as particularly virtuous. This ideal of single marriage conflicted with the practical reality of a society where divorce was easy and remarriage common, creating a tension between ideal and practice that characterized many aspects of Roman attitudes toward marriage and women. Motherhood was central to a Roman woman's identity and social role. The production of legitimate heirs was the primary purpose of marriage from society's perspective, and a woman who bore children, especially sons, fulfilled her fundamental duty and earned respect and honor. The Romans valued motherhood highly, and mothers held a special place in Roman culture and sentiment, honored in literature, law, and social practice. Pregnancy in ancient Rome was both a time of hope and a time of danger. Women faced pregnancy without modern medical knowledge or technology, relying on midwives, folk wisdom, and prayers to the gods. Romans understood that pregnancy occurred through sexual intercourse, though their understanding of the biological mechanisms was limited and often incorrect. Various theories about conception existed, some suggesting that both parents contributed seed, others that the mother simply nourished the father's seed. Pregnant women would make offerings to various deities associated with childbirth, particularly Juno Lucina, the goddess who brought babies into the light, and Diana, who also protected women in childbirth. They might wear amulets for protection and follow various traditions meant to ensure a safe delivery. Midwives would monitor the pregnancy, offering advice on diet, exercise, and behavior. Pregnant women of the upper classes might be attended by doctors as well as midwives, though medical knowledge was limited, and medical intervention in normal pregnancy was rare. Childbirth itself was dangerous, with maternal mortality rates that seem shocking by modern standards. Ancient sources rarely give us statistics, but scholars estimate that perhaps 1 to 2% of births resulted in the mother's death, and over a woman's reproductive lifetime, with multiple pregnancies, the cumulative risk was substantial. Women were well aware of these dangers, and childbirth was approached with prayers, protective rituals, and the support of other women who had survived the ordeal. Labor and delivery took place in the home, attended by midwives and female relatives and friends. Men were typically excluded from the birthing room, as childbirth was considered women's business. The laboring woman might sit in a birthing chair or squat, while the midwife and her assistants helped her through the process. Various techniques and tools existed to assist difficult births, though these were often dangerous and could result in the death of mother, child, or both. Pain relief was limited to herbal preparations whose effectiveness varied. Once a child was born, the midwife would cut the umbilical cord, wash the baby, and present it to the father. At this point, the father made a crucial decision, whether to accept or reject the child. Infant exposure was legal and practiced in Rome, though how common it actually was is debated. A father might reject a child who appeared sickly or deformed, or if the family already had too many daughters or couldn't afford another child. Rejected infants were literally put outside, exposed in public places where they might die or might be picked up by someone who would raise them, usually as slaves. The decision to expose an infant was the father's, not the mother's, though mothers surely tried to influence these decisions. Infant exposure was more likely for girls than boys, as sons were more valued for continuing the family line and name. This preference for sons was clear throughout Roman culture, though daughters were valued too, particularly as links in marriage alliances. The exposure of infants troubles modern sensibilities, but Romans seemed to view it differently, as a necessary if unfortunate practice in a world without reliable contraception and with limited resources. If the father accepted the child, a ritual called the lustration would occur on the 8th or 9th day after birth. This ceremony purified the infant and marked its formal acceptance into the family. The baby would be given a name, offerings would be made to the gods, and the family would celebrate. Girls received a personal name at this ceremony, while boys received a full three-part name including the family name and a personal name. The lustration was a significant family occasion, attended by relatives and friends. Early childhood was entirely under the mother's care, assisted by enslaved nurses and caregivers in wealthy families. Infants would be wrapped in swaddling cloth, believed to help them develop properly, and would be breastfed, either by the mother or by a wet nurse. Breastfeeding could last for 2 or 3 years, and the Romans believed it created a bond between nurse and child, which is why some moralists criticized the use of wet nurses as denying children their mother's care and influence. As children grew, mothers continued to play a central role in their upbringing, though the father's role increased, especially for boys. Mothers taught young children basic skills, moral values, and religious practices. In the early years, boys and girls were raised together, but as they grew older, their education and preparation for adult life diverged significantly. Boys would eventually leave the domestic sphere to be educated and prepared for public life, while girls remained under their mother's tutelage, learning the skills they would need as wives and mothers themselves. The mother-child bond was recognized as powerful and important in Roman culture. Mothers were expected to love their children, to care for them, and to want the best for them. Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi, was celebrated not just for her virtue, but for her devoted motherhood, her careful education of her sons, and her support of their political careers even after their deaths. Her example shows that motherhood could be a source of pride, influence, and lasting fame. However, the high infant and child mortality rate meant that many children died before reaching adulthood. Disease, accident, and the harsh realities of ancient life claimed many young lives. Epitaphs and tombstones testify to parents' grief for lost children, with touching inscriptions that speak of love and sorrow. Parents would dedicate grave monuments to children who had died, sometimes noting how many years, months, or even days the child had lived. This grief was genuine and profound, despite the frequency with which it occurred. The relationship between mothers and grown children, especially sons, could be complex and powerful. Roman sons were expected to honor and respect their mothers, even as adults. The bond between mother and son was celebrated in Roman culture and could be a source of mutual support and influence. Mothers advised their sons, supported their ambitions, and mourned their failures and deaths. Some of the most powerful women in Roman history derived their influence primarily from their relationships with their sons. The relationship between mothers and daughters was also important, though less frequently discussed in our sources. Mothers taught daughters the skills they would need as wives and mothers, passed on family traditions and knowledge, and helped arrange their marriages. A daughter's marriage might be the mother's responsibility, especially if the father was dead or absent. Mothers and daughters might maintain close relationships throughout their lives, with adult daughters visiting their mothers, seeking their advice, and caring for them in old age. Stepmothers were common in Roman society due to the frequency of remarriage after widowhood or divorce. Roman literature often portrayed stepmothers negatively, as cruel women who favored their own children over their stepchildren and schemed against them. This stereotype probably had some basis in reality, as combining families from previous marriages could create tension and conflict over inheritance and favoritism. However, many stepmothers undoubtedly developed genuine affection for their stepchildren and provided them with care and support. The Romans did not practice widespread infanticide of legitimate children born within lawful marriage. The exposure of infants was different from killing children who had been accepted into the family. Once a child had been through the lustration ceremony and named, killing that child would have been murder. Children were valued and loved, though the expression of this love might differ from modern expectations. Roman parents could be stern and demanding, expecting obedience and often using physical punishment, yet they also invested significant resources in their children's upbringing and welfare. Religion provided Roman women with some of their most important public roles and opportunities for participation in civic life. Unlike political office, which was closed to women, many religious roles were open to them, and some were exclusively female. Through religious participation, women could exercise authority, gain prestige, and contribute to the welfare of the community in ways that were publicly recognized and honored. The Vestal Virgins were the most prestigious and unusual female religious role in Rome. These were 6 priestesses who tended the sacred fire of Vesta, goddess of the hearth. The Vestals were chosen as young girls between the ages of 6 and 10, from among the daughters of respectable families. They served for 30 years, during which they were required to maintain absolute chastity. After their service, they were free to leave and marry, though few did, as they enjoyed such privilege and status in their roles. The Vestals held an extraordinary position in Roman society. They were freed from their father's authority when they joined the order and came under the authority of the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest. They could own property, make wills, and were exempt from the guardianship that normally controlled adult women's legal transactions. They had the best seats at public spectacles. Consuls and praetors made way for them on the streets, and they could grant clemency to condemned criminals they met by chance. If a Vestal swore an oath, it was accepted without question. However, their privileges came with severe responsibilities and dangers. If the sacred fire they tended went out, it was seen as a terrible omen for Rome, and the Vestal responsible would be punished. Even worse, if a Vestal was accused of breaking her vow of chastity, she could be tried and, if found guilty, buried alive in an underground chamber with a small amount of food and water, left to die. This horrific punishment was rare, but did occur several times in Roman history, usually during periods of crisis when the community sought scapegoats for its troubles. Beyond the Vestals, numerous other priesthoods and religious roles were open to women. The wife of the Flamen Dialis, the priest of Jupiter, was herself a priestess called the Flaminica Dialis, with her own religious duties and restrictions. Women served as priestesses of various gods and goddesses, maintained temples, and participated in religious rituals. Some of these roles were quite prestigious and could bring the holder significant status and influence. Women's religious festivals provided important opportunities for female community and celebration. The Bodadea festival was exclusively for women, held annually at the house of a senior magistrate. Men were strictly excluded, and the rites were secret, though we know they involved wine, music, and sacrifice. The fact that men were excluded from this important religious celebration shows that Roman women had their own religious sphere separate from male authority and oversight. The Vestalia in June honored Vesta and involved rituals performed by married women. During this festival, women would walk barefoot to Vesta's temple and make offerings. The Matralia in June was a festival for mothers, celebrating Mater Matuta, a goddess of dawn and childbirth. These and other festivals created a calendar of religious observance that structured women's lives and provided occasions for female gathering, celebration, and religious expression. In the provinces, women sometimes held even more prominent religious roles than in Rome itself. In the Greek East, priestesses could hold significant authority and status. Some cities appointed women as civic priestesses with substantial responsibilities and honors. Wealthy women would fund temple buildings, sponsor festivals, and provide for religious celebrations, gaining public recognition and lasting fame through inscriptions and dedications. Women also participated in the mystery religions that became increasingly popular in the late Republican Empire. The cult of Isis, which came to Rome from Egypt, was particularly popular among women. Isis was a powerful goddess associated with motherhood, magic, and salvation, and her cult offered women meaningful religious participation and the promise of a blessed afterlife. The cult of Bacchus, though periodically suppressed by nervous authorities, also attracted female devotees who participated in ecstatic rituals. Beyond formal religious roles, women's religious practice permeated daily life. Women made offerings at household shrines, prayed to various deities for protection and favor, participated in processions and festivals, and consulted oracles and fortune-tellers. Religion was not separate from ordinary life, but woven throughout it, and women's religious activities were essential to maintaining the community's relationship with the gods and ensuring divine favor. Women also participated in public life in other ways, though always constrained by their exclusion from political office and voting. In the late Republic, there are documented cases of women gathering in public protest. When the Senate proposed a law that would limit the amount of gold and luxury goods women could own, women took to the streets in protest, blocking access to the forum and lobbying individual senators. The law was eventually repealed, a rare instance of successful female political activism. The incident shows both that women could organize and protest publicly and that such behavior was considered unusual and even scandalous. Wealthy women were public benefactors, funding buildings, games, and festivals. Inscriptions from across the Roman world record women's public generosity. A woman might pay for the construction of a public building, sponsor gladiatorial games or theatrical performances, or provide for distributions of food or money to the populace. These benefactions were a way for wealthy women to gain honor and status, to be remembered, and to contribute to their communities. The inscriptions dedicating these benefactions ensured that the woman's name and generosity would be publicly known and celebrated. Some women were honored with public statues, a significant mark of distinction. These statues might commemorate a woman's benefactions, her service as a priestess, or her connection to important men. While far fewer statues were erected to women than to men, those that were created testified to certain women's achievements and status. The bases of these statues often bore inscriptions listing the woman's accomplishments and virtues, creating a public record of her life. Women attended public spectacles, though with some restrictions. At gladiatorial games and theatrical performances, women might be restricted to certain seating areas, typically the back rows or upper seats. Augustus instituted regulations about seating at spectacles, assigning different groups to different areas to maintain social hierarchy and order. Despite these restrictions, women did attend these events, enjoying the entertainment and spectacle along with the rest of the population. The baths were an important part of Roman social life, and women used them, though typically at different times than men, or in separate facilities. The baths were not just for bathing, but were social centers where people gathered, exercised, and relaxed. Women's use of the baths was sometimes criticized by moralists who worried about impropriety, but women continued to use these facilities, enjoying the opportunity for cleanliness, socialization, and leisure. Shopping and commerce brought women into public spaces regularly. Markets and shops were places where women of all classes went to purchase food, cloth, and other necessities. Some women were merchants themselves, running shops and stalls. The forum and other public spaces would have been filled with women going about their business, making the Roman city a place where women were visibly present, even if they lacked formal political power. Education for Roman girls was less systematic and comprehensive than education for boys, but it was not entirely absent, especially in upper-class families. The level and type of education a girl received depended heavily on her family's wealth, status, and values. Some families believed in educating daughters as well as sons, while others saw little point in extensive education for girls, who would become wives and mothers rather than public figures. Basic literacy and numeracy were taught to many girls of the middling and upper classes. Learning to read and write Latin and sometimes Greek would allow a woman to manage household accounts, write letters, and read literature. This level of education was practical and useful for a materfamilias, who would need to oversee a complex household. Some girls received more advanced education, studying grammar, rhetoric, literature, and philosophy, though this was less common and more controversial. The controversy over women's education centered on the question of what purpose it served. Critics argued that education would make women immodest, give them ideas above their station, or distract them from their proper duties. They worried that educated women might become too independent or might use their learning in inappropriate ways. Supporters of women's education argued that educated mothers could better educate their children, that learning made women more interesting companions to their husbands, and that knowledge and culture were valuable in themselves. Some families employed tutors for their daughters, just as they did for their sons. Though the girls' education might be less extensive, other girls attended primary schools alongside boys, learning basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. Very few girls went on to the equivalent of secondary education, and none attended the rhetorical schools that prepared boys for public life, as women had no need for public speaking skills in a society where they could not appear in court or the Senate. Despite these limitations, some Roman women became remarkably educated and cultured. They read Greek and Latin literature, studied philosophy, wrote poetry and letters, and participated in intellectual discussions. These women were exceptional, and their education was often noted and sometimes criticized as unusual. Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi, was celebrated for her eloquence and learning. Sempronia, described by the historian Sallust, could read and write, play music, and converse intelligently, though Sallust portrayed these accomplishments as somewhat suspicious in a woman. Sulpicia the poet left us a small corpus of love elegies written in the late 1st century BCE. Her poems are brief, personal, and emotionally direct, expressing her feelings for a lover named Cerinthus. They show that at least some women wrote poetry, and that women's voices and perspectives could be expressed in literature, even if far fewer women's writings survived than men's. We know of other female poets and writers from references in male authors' works, suggesting that women's literary production was more extensive than the surviving evidence indicates. Women's letters give us some of our most intimate glimpses into their lives and thoughts. The letters between Cicero and his wife Terentia show a partnership dealing with family matters, financial concerns, and political crises. Other letter collections include correspondence with or from women, discussing everything from domestic trivia to philosophical questions. These letters show women as active participants in literary culture, as thinkers and communicators, not just passive subjects of male writing. Medical and scientific knowledge was another area where some women excelled. Midwives needed significant medical knowledge to assist in childbirth and to treat women's health issues. Some midwives became quite famous for their skill and knowledge. The Dr. Soranus, writing in the early 2nd century CE, described what qualities and knowledge a midwife should have, indicating that these women needed to understand anatomy, physiology, and therapeutic techniques. Some women practiced medicine more broadly, treating various ailments and conditions, though the extent of female medical practice is debated. Women participated in philosophical discussions and movements. Musonius Rufus, a Stoic philosopher of the 1st century CE, argued that women should study philosophy just as men did, as philosophy taught virtue and reason, which women needed as much as men. He described women attending philosophical lectures and engaging in philosophical discussions. While Musonius was probably exceptional in his support for women's philosophical education, his testimony shows that some women did pursue philosophy. The Empress Plotina, wife of Trajan, was known for her philosophical interests and her support of philosophers. She corresponded with philosophers, attended philosophical lectures, and intervened on behalf of philosophical schools, using her position to support intellectual culture. Later empresses and aristocratic women also supported scholars and philosophers, acting as patrons of learning and culture. Women's voices in religion could be quite powerful. Prophetesses and oracles, women who claimed to speak with divine authority, commanded respect and attention. The Sibylline books, collections of prophecies supposedly written by the Sibyl of Cumae, a female prophet, were consulted by Roman authorities in times of crisis throughout Rome's history. Female prophets and fortune-tellers were common throughout the Roman world, serving clients who sought their wisdom and predictions. Women's religious hymns and prayers would have been performed publicly during festivals and ceremonies. While we have few surviving texts of these compositions, we know they existed and that skilled women would have composed and performed them. The Vestal Virgins, for instance, performed specific hymns and prayers as part of their religious duties, preserving ancient texts and traditions. Women also participated in the transmission of oral culture, songs, stories, lullabies, folk wisdom, and traditional knowledge. Mothers, nurses, and enslaved women told stories to children, teaching them about gods and heroes, about right and wrong, about Roman history and traditions. While this oral culture was rarely written down and has largely been lost to us, it was crucial to cultural transmission and socialization, and women were its primary carriers. Some women became famous or infamous for their speech and behavior in ways that were recorded for posterity. Hortensia, daughter of the orator Hortensius, gave a speech before the triumvirs during the civil wars, protesting a special tax on wealthy women. Her speech, which argued that women should not be taxed when they had no political voice, was remembered and praised by later authors. Similarly, Macia, who defended herself successfully in court, and was nicknamed androgyne for her masculine behavior in speaking publicly, was remembered as an exceptional woman who stepped outside normal female behavior. These exceptional women show us the boundaries of what was possible, even if not typical, for Roman women. They demonstrate that despite legal restrictions and social expectations, determined and talented women could achieve recognition for their learning, their eloquence, their creativity, and their wisdom. They carved out spaces for female intellectual and creative expression within a society that generally valued women for other qualities. The economic life of Roman women was far more active and varied than traditional stereotypes of cloistered domesticity suggest. Women across all social classes engaged in productive labor, managed property, and participated in the economy, though the type of work they did and the recognition they received for it varied enormously based on their social status. For enslaved women, work was compulsory and often grueling. Enslaved women worked in every imaginable capacity, as domestic servants, cooks, cleaners, and nurses, as agricultural laborers in fields and vineyards, as workers in workshops producing textiles, pottery, and other goods, as prostitutes in brothels, as entertainers and musicians. Their labor was essential to the functioning of the Roman economy, yet they received no compensation beyond their basic maintenance and had no control over the fruits of their labor. Freed women, former enslaved people who had gained their liberty, often continued in similar occupations, but now working for themselves or for wages. A freed woman might continue to work for her former owner, but now as an employee with at least some economic independence. Many freed women became quite successful in business, accumulating property and wealth. Freed women worked as shopkeepers, tavern owners, artisans, and in various trades. Their success stories show that economic opportunity existed for women who were skilled and determined, even if they started from the lowest social position. Women of the lower free classes worked in a wide variety of occupations. Archaeological evidence, particularly from Pompeii, shows women working as bakers, running thermopolia or fast food establishments, managing inns and taverns, selling produce in markets, working as washerwomen and fullers, producing and selling textiles, and in many other trades. While some occupations were more commonly male, there were few absolute prohibitions on women's work, and necessity drove many women into labor that might be considered inappropriate for upper-class women, but was perfectly normal for the poor. Textile production was the most common and accepted form of female labor across all classes. The idealized Roman wife worked wool, spinning thread and weaving cloth for her household. This image was so powerful that spindles and weaving tools appear on women's tombstones as symbols of femininity and domesticity. However, textile work was not just symbolic. It was real, important, and economically significant. Textile production was labor-intensive, requiring many hours of work to produce cloth for clothing, bedding, and other uses. Women's textile work clothed their families and provided a marketable commodity. On a larger scale, textile production was a significant industry, and women worked in this industry both as enslaved laborers and as free workers and business owners. Workshops producing cloth employed numerous women, and some women owned and operated these workshops themselves. The inscriptional and archaeological evidence shows women in supervisory roles in textile production, managing other workers and organizing the production process. Women also worked in agriculture, particularly on small family farms where all family members contributed to the labor. Women would plant, weed, harvest, tend animals, process food for storage, and perform countless other agricultural tasks. This work was essential to the family's survival, but was rarely discussed in literary sources, which focused on elite life rather than peasant agriculture. Only archaeological and demographic studies have made the extent of women's agricultural labor clear to modern scholars. Midwifery was a skilled profession practiced by women for women. Midwives attended childbirths, provided prenatal and postnatal care, and treated women's health issues. Some midwives gained considerable reputation and presumably commanded good fees for their services. Medical knowledge was passed from experienced midwives to apprentices, creating a tradition of female medical expertise. Some midwives were educated and literate, able to read medical texts and keep records. Women also worked as wet nurses, breastfeeding other women's children for pay. This was a significant service in a society where infant mortality was high, and successful breastfeeding could mean the difference between life and death. Wet nurses were carefully selected, as Romans believed that moral qualities and characteristics could be transmitted through breast milk, so the nurse's character mattered as much as her health and milk supply. Wet nurses might live in their employers' houses or take the infants into their own homes to nurse. Teaching was another occupation open to women, though it seems to have been less common than for men. Women taught young children basic literacy and numeracy, either in small schools or as private tutors in wealthy homes. Some women became quite respected as teachers, though we know far less about female teachers than about male grammarians and rhetoricians. whose students sometimes recorded their teachers' names and accomplishments. Women in commerce ran shops, sold goods in markets, and engaged in trade. They might sell food, wine, clothing, household goods, cosmetics, jewelry, and various other products. Some women owned larger commercial enterprises, managing shops, warehouses, or even shipping concerns. They engaged in contracts, sued and were sued, lent money and participated fully in commercial life, with the legal fiction that their guardians authorized their transactions. Property ownership and management was a major part of upper-class women's economic activity. Women owned agricultural estates, urban real estate, and various other properties. While they might employ bailiffs and stewards to manage these properties on a daily basis, wealthy women made major decisions about their estates, determined how resources would be allocated, and reaped the profits. Some women became quite wealthy through inheritance, astute management, and fortunate investments. Women were also patrons, providing financial support to clients in exchange for loyalty and services. Wealthy women had male and female clients who depended on them for support, loans, and opportunities. This patron-client relationship was fundamental to Roman society, and women participated in it just as men did. A wealthy woman might support dozens or hundreds of clients, giving her significant social influence and a network of people obligated to her. Women made wills, leaving their property to heirs they chose, within certain legal constraints. A woman's will might provide for her children, reward loyal servants, make bequests to friends, or fund public benefactions. The ability to dispose of property by will gave women a measure of control over their wealth even after death, and allowed them to express their values and relationships through their bequests. Money lending was another activity in which women engaged. They might lend money to relatives, friends, or business associates, either as personal loans or as business investments. The interest earned on these loans could provide significant income. Some women seem to have been quite active in financial matters, managing complex portfolios of loans and investments. Women's economic activity shows that legal disabilities did not prevent many women from actively participating in economic life. While they operated under the nominal supervision of male guardians, in practice many women made their own economic decisions, ran their own businesses, and managed their own property. The gap between legal theory and economic reality allowed women considerable room for economic agency and achievement.